in, and I'm sure there'll be a few more people coming as we go. So welcome everyone. This is our second event of the Fen and District Council's Wisbech High Street project, which is looking at educating on people on traditional skills. Your talk today is going to be by Alex. So Alex Wenham is a prize-winning stone carver of long experience based in Oxford. He specialises in the repair and replacement of historic carved detail for conservation projects. He's worked on stone buildings of every century from the 11th to the 21st and has been fortunate to provide carved detail for many prestigious buildings in the UK and France. These include the House of Parliament, St Paul's Cathedral, Château de Versailles, Chartres Cathedral and the Louvre, among many others. Alex, I'll hand you over now.
Hi, thanks Pip. Hi everyone. Right, so yes, like Pip said, I'm Alex. I'm a stone carver based in Oxford. Hi Debbie, by the way, I saw you pop up, Debbie Dance. You were probably on mute. Anyway, nice to see your face momentarily. Right, so I'm going to do a talk about the kind of work that I do, which is carving projects for architectural conservation. So typically I'm replacing or repairing carved detail on old buildings, and a lot of the pictures will be of things in Oxford. I also lived in France for many years, so some of the pictures are jobs I worked on in France. I'm going to share my screen now. Just to say before I do, I'll do loads of questions at the end if people want, but equally, if you've got a question that feels really relevant to the moment and it doesn't look like I'm about to answer it, then I definitely don't mind if anybody wants to put up a hand. I'll answer questions as I go as well. Okay, here we go. Open share tray. Okay, there we go. And I'll do it as a slideshow. Pip, can you see that?
Yep, that looks great.
Okay, right. So like the title says here, I'm going to talk about some case studies. So I'm going to talk first about the types of the types of things that I do, the typical sort of actions that I carry out time and again, and then we'll look at some case studies, and I'm going to throw out some some thorny issues in conservation ethics as well. Most of them are to do with carvings, but some of them are to do with sculpture generally, and I'll finish with a couple more case studies. And there's a fair bit here to get through, so I'm going to rattle through it as quickly as I can. Does anyone have any? Well, if anyone has any questions at any point, just say. Pip, are you okay for me to just go ahead?
Yep, go ahead. Okay.
So in the architectural carving work that I do, there are three things that I'm basically doing time and time again. So there are these three things that are listed here: whole stone replacement, indent repairs, and mortar repairs. So I'll go through some pictures showing some of those. This is a job I worked on in Paris at Grand Palais, which is a big public building in Paris. So here are some carved capitals, which you can see are in very poor condition. They're carved in very soft limestone. These are only about a century old, and they've completely disintegrated. You can see the one in the foreground there is missing a massive part of the volute, and all of the readable detail is disappearing fast. So France has a more heavy-handed approach to conservation, I would say, than the UK. So these were destined to be replaced entirely. So we cut them out of the wall. Here are some new ones being carved. I'm not in that picture. I was working on the one on the left here. I took the picture. There were three of us carvers working on this job, preparing these capitals. So because they're in pairs side by side, we had to carve one end of each one before they were fixed, because they come very close to each other and there wouldn't have been space to get to those faces. The rest of them were carved once they were in the wall. Here's one going up now. Here it is in the wall, and you can see that the masonry has been roughed out, and I'm getting ready to start the carved detail. So I've got a template which I've pricked through and then tapped coloured pigment through to give to give an impression of the detail to be carved. And of course the template's reversible, so you can have a left and right that mirror each other. And then here I am carving some of that detail there, and I think there are some close-ups of these. There we go, that's what they look like now. And there's some detail. Here they are. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but they're the capitals at the top of those pairs of columns there. So that's replacing when a whole stone is sufficiently decayed that there's simply no case to be made for saving it. We can replace the entire thing. If there's damage which is localized damage in a stone that's otherwise sound and healthy, then we carry out repairs called indents. So here are some examples of indent repairs. Here's one I did at St. Paul's. You can see, again, I don't know if you can see the cursor arrow, but it's that section of the angel's wing, his right hand on our left wing there. The rest of the stone was intact, but that part had completely broken off, probably some kind of physical damage, like being knocked with something, because it's quite low down on the building. So I cut a pocket around it, pieced in a new piece of stone, and then carved it in situ to align with everything around it. Here are some more indents. This was the handle of a sword being held by a statue at Chartres. And you can see in the picture on the left, the handle is completely, it's decayed. It's got fissures running right through it, and it's been cemented back together and some mortar repairs made with cementitious material. The whole thing's falling apart again. It's quite unsightly. So this one here, we took the whole handle off. You can see in the middle picture the hole waiting to receive the indent, which I carved nearby, but not completely in situ, and then offered it up and fixed it in place. I can't remember. Oh, here's a big indent repair that I carried out at the Houses of Parliament. This was a couple of years ago. So this shield panel, it's an internal piece of indoor carving, but it backs onto an outside roof, and there'd been lots of water damage coming through from the outside that had caused the whole thing to decay, and parts of it had fallen and broken further. So the crown had fallen and broken. But the architects wanted to save as much of it as they possibly could. So the portion of it that's in the bottom left-hand side, the shield and the parts of the scroll that are still intact, were to be saved and then pieced into a new stone. So you can see that here. So here's the saved part and a new block of stone that's been cut to fit it neatly, and then to carve the missing pieces using the existing as a model to align with the existing part there. So there's some pencil lines, and I'm beginning to remove some of the volumes. Here's the new stone. It hasn't been fixed together yet, so I still had the part that we were keeping separate, and I've glued the crown back together with resin so that I've got it as an intact model. And you can see the pins that are going to be concealed on the inside of the carving there to receive it. And there are more pins top and at the side across the joint in the unseen part of the stone in the joint. And this picture is showing a grout of lime mortar, a lime grout, also filling the void behind it, where they're just to make sure that all of the spaces are filled and nicely, neatly filled in. And then finishing off the carving. So here's removing more of the volumes, carrying on removing more of the volumes, and there's the finished carving on a pallet, and then the polychrome happened after it was installed, and here it is now with the colouring in. That's it now. So those are some indent repairs. If anyone, oh yeah, and here's the third kind of thing that I'm doing, which is mortar repairs. Now we tend to do these if a stone is largely intact from a structural point of view, but if it's got weather, eroded detail on its surface, then you can build up missing areas with a colour matched mortar repair. So here's an example of one of those that I did. This is the pediment of a church in a village in France, and the architect wanted to restore some of the missing detail on the carving, but without cutting into the existing material and piecing in a new stone. So in the sort of not quite before, but sort of during picture on the lower left, you can see the bottom area of the pediment has got a pale section where a lime mortar has been built up in that area, and this particular mortar is it goes off has a consistency similar to the stone, and it can be worked like a stone once it's hardened. So this central area there, I've begun some of the masonry work. There's one little flower on the right hand side that I've carved there to match the two original ones next to it. And in this area on the left of the picture, I've completed finding some of the forms in there. And the picture on the top right is the after picture, after all of the conservation work has been done, all of the joints around the arch have been filled in, various mortar repairs have been done to the arch itself, and in the area of carved detail in question, in the centre of this pediment, we've also done colour matched sort of colouring in job to make it correspond to what's around it. Right. So those are the three techniques that for architectural carving purposes in conservation world we're doing time and time again. Again, if anyone's got a question about any of that stuff, feel free to flag it up, or equally I'll do questions at the end. Here I'm going to go through some issues in conservation ethics, so largely based around this question, when to intervene and when to leave alone, which for carved detail pops up all the time, because the bits of carved detail that often are most badly damaged are all the sticking out parts that are have really important readable detail, but are also historically significant in their own right. And there are often some thorny issues to untangle around some of those questions. So, for example, this picture here is from an English church, and the heads have all been smashed off by a person, probably during the English Civil War or possibly earlier during the Reformation. And so, of course, the fact of that damage has historical significance in and of itself. Current guidance from English Heritage and other bodies is that in our country in present day we would leave this kind of historical evidence as it is, although it's also true to say that in other places around the world, you know, that they have a sort of more an approach which is more consistent with putting things the way the original designer intended. So, for example, here this statue is in Palmyra and is an object that was damaged deliberately recently by ISIS, and this one has been restored. Here it is now. It's been done with an honest repair, so a piece has been let into it which is a different color so that you can see that it's a replaced part, but really I think it you know, it has to be said that what those ISIS people were doing, smashing up imagery in museums in Syria and so on, is it's nothing that Puritan iconoclasts in the 16th and 17th centuries wouldn't have been happy to get on board with. The only difference is the time that's lapsed in between. Here's another example of something that's deliberately left unrepaired. This is bomb damage from Second World War, aerial bombardment. This is at the V&A. There are some other examples around London. Mostly this kind of damage by now has largely been repaired. And I think it's important to leave some evidence of quite how violent those weapons could be. Just to give some context to that, if you were to hit this wall, this is Portland stone, which is a pretty firm stone. If you were to hit this wall as hard as you could with a big hammer, you might make a bit of damage. The size of this piece here, for example. I don't know if you can see my cursor. There's one of those two small bits on the left-hand side. So you can see that to smash out stone the size of the bigger holes, you really need something quite violent, and it's important, I think, to have some evidence of this. In this picture, I'd probably be tempted to do a repair job on the cornice at the top in the setback area there, because there you can see there's water damage leaching down the building. It's probably going into the building. It's definitely making a mess of the wall. So I think there's a good case for replacing that section with the drip at the top. Here's a lovely piece of evidence that connects people in a really human way to the past. I personally love to walk up worn treads to stairs. I'm not alone in that. It's wonderful. It's really evocative to stand on those steps and think about all the feet that might have walked up them in the past. And you can imagine people walking up and down those steps with Victorian top hats and Georgian periwigs and all sorts. And it's quite a moving way of emotionally connecting with the past. And it's a lovely thing right up until the moment where somebody takes a tumble and you have a lawsuit on your hands. So there's health and safety questions to consider, again, in amongst some of the questions of when to address an issue and when to leave it alone. It's not a coincidence, I think, that some of the higher up steps in this picture on the left-hand side have been replaced. Right, another example of something that is a question mark of what to deal with is if something has been repaired in the past in a way that is that's not right. So I'm going to show you a picture of a statue. We're looking at the statue of St. Mary Magdalene in the central niche at the top of Magdalen College's entrance gateway. Here are two pictures of this statue. It's the same statue. The one on the left is what the statue looks like today. And on the right is what the statue looked like when it was first installed. This photo is from 1885. And I'm looking in particular at the hands and the jar of oil that Mary Magdalene is holding. You can see that they're quite different. And what's happened is at some point in the past, the original hands and jar have either broken away completely or become so badly decayed that they needed replacing. And somebody has replaced them, certainly without having had access to the original, to the Victorian photograph on the right here, because they certainly wouldn't have carved it in that way. That's quite different. Otherwise, you can imagine a kind of conversation with an aged college porter who could just about remember that she was holding a jar with her right hand and she was half lifting off the lid, and based on some scant evidence, somebody has come up with a way of restoring the statue, but done in a way that I think it's been handled a bit clumsily. The hands are rather large. The design of the jar is completely different, and the repair itself is decaying at a faster rate than the stone around it. So as part of a scheme of works that we're going to be carrying out on this is a job that I'm involved in, we included in the application for consent to redo that repair, and we've got consent for that. Here's an example of where damage can take on really important significance in its own right. This sculpture used to stand between the Twin Towers in New York. There it is on the left in its original condition, and it largely survived amazingly the events of 9/11, and it now stands in Battery Park in New York as a testament to that day. And most people, I think, would probably agree that the damage that sculpture sustained that day is of much greater significance than the original sculpture, and that it's almost unthinkable to repair it and put it back to the way it was. And yet, if you were the original sculptor of that work, you could completely legitimately think, well, hold on, that's not the way I made it. I want it the way I made it. And so it's an example of how certain types of damage can take on significance of their own. Here's another thorny issue, and when to leave alone and when to address a thing is particularly, this crops up time and time again with carved detail, and I come across buildings all the time with this on. This is where a building has been intended to have carved detail carved into areas of it, and for one reason or another, often to do with money, but also other things, not all of the carving work is finished. So this is the Natural History Museum in Oxford, and it's by no means alone in Oxford. There are many buildings with this phenomenon happening on. So you can see, for example, if you look above the main entrance doorway, that 3-light window there, the 2 central columns, the capitals have been carved there, but the pair of capitals in the window jambs on the left and right have been left as square blocks. And if you look around the other windows, some of them have had the capitals and other detail carved around the inside the hood mold of the arch and on the window jambs, and other windows have had nothing done to them at all. They've simply had carving reservations installed and then never addressed. I should say it would be extremely unlikely to ever get consent to do this carving in this particular case, even though we have good evidence from the architect's drawings of what they were intended to look like. But often you can get consent to do these things. Here's a job that I was involved in France, and this is a Romanesque church which had a fair bit of rebuilding done to it in the 19th century. The picture on the left there are 2 19th century stone replacements that were never carved, and they've been daubed with various layers of paint, which is why they've got that flaky grey look. And on the right, the picture is the ones that I carved into them. It was following a fire in this church. There was a lot of rebuilding done, and as part of that program, they got consent to have this pair of capitals carved, which was cool. And the problem of 2021, this is the thing of our day in public sculpture, is where heritage is contested or problematic. So, of course, the famous Rhodes statue that is a thorny issue in Oxford at the moment, and on the right is also in Oxford. One of the colleges in Oxford, All Souls, has a magnificent library that was entirely bankrolled by a family who raised all their financial might from slave plantations, and the problems of how to address this kind of difficult heritage are going to keep coming back, I think. And you know, there isn't one simple answer to this. If anyone's interested, I saw recently the Church of England has published some guidance on how to tackle some of these problems. You can imagine a number of little parish churches that might have a marble plaque commemorating somebody who made a fortune out of things that we would now consider difficult, but not an easy problem. Also not an easy problem are these 2 pictures here. I guess some of you might know where these are. The top left is Coventry, bottom right is Dresden. Both of these were destroyed in the Second World War, and handled. This problem was treated entirely differently in each case. So in the next picture is what was done to these buildings, and I've got these photos up here really as a sort of thinking point, a starting point to start thinking about what the way you treat a problem with decayed stonework or damaged stonework can say about you. And in some ways, these make statements that perhaps they were and perhaps they weren't even intended to make. But you can see, well, in Coventry, this building work was planned in the years very shortly after the Second World War, when when everything was still fresh in people's minds, and you could probably read different things into the decision to not rebuild the cathedral as it was, but to create something entirely different next door and to leave the bombed out cathedral as a shell. And Dresden, interestingly, the church was left as a ruin during all the time that Dresden lay behind the Iron Curtain in East Germany. And you can sort of imagine a decision-making process that was a bit like, we'll leave this as a testament to show what those Westerners did to us. And then after German reunification, very quickly, this project was put together to entirely rebuild the Frauenkirche as it had been before. And if you wanted to, you could probably read into that decision making a nation looking for wholeness and and healing. Right. So I'm going to just check the time, and I'm going to rattle through a couple more case studies, and then if you like we can have some questions and things. So here are a couple more projects I've been involved in recent years. This was the restoration of a statue in Oxford. Here's the before picture. So these fellows are doing a kind of wrestling called shawl wrestling, which is incredibly dangerous and illegal, has been illegal for many centuries, where what you do is you hold a strap round the back of your opponent's neck, and then you, using the strap, you try to fling your opponent to the ground. Anyway, this statue is probably not original. If it was, it would be 1508. It's probably a later copy. And at some point in the past, I think it's fallen, and the bottom part of it was replaced. So the all four legs and the plinth that they stand on were replaced as an indent. We think probably in the late Victorian period. And as you can see, using a stone that was much softer than the upper part that's older, and it's really decayed quite dramatically. So the leg on the right is completely missing a part. The leg on the left, as you look at it, has also got a great big crack, an open crack running right through it. And the plinth underneath has lost loads of its detail, and the binding minerals in the stone have also leached out, so that the whole thing is very soft and friable. The whole thing was, well, it was a health and safety hazard as much as anything, because it was standing on little more than a sandcastle, really. So we got consent to redo that repair, and then generally clean the upper part and then rebuild it. So there are some process pictures of that job I've got here. So first of all, as part of the application process, I did a survey of the statue. So you can see that I've broken it down into different sections and the different types of decay that have happened. Then the thing came to my workshop. So the way that I'd planned to do this job was to use, once I'd separated the two parts from each other, use the original lower part as a starting point for a model to replace it in new stone. So I've got the original lower part there underneath, and I've built up the missing detail in plaster of Paris onto that original stone. So the white parts are where decayed areas had worn away, and I've rebuilt them in plaster. And this way, then I'm offering up the statue to the base in these pictures to check alignment and so on. And then, where did I go next? Well, the head of one of them had also worked its way loose from a previous repair, and it was around the areas around the neck were sort of falling out. So this is the jigsaw puzzle of the head, which I drilled out the original pin that was rusty metal pin, and I've replaced this one with a carbon fiber pin, and rebuilt the head, including the jigsaw puzzle around the neck. So all of those pieces, all of those numbered pieces, in fact, went back into the shawl around his neck. And it's the fellow in the foreground in the right hand picture here, with the ratchet strap. That's the resin setting in his neck. I resined the head back on and held it in place with the ratchet strap while the glue cured. Cleaned up the upper part. So this is just cleaning very gently, just with water and a natural bristle brush, nothing more than that. And the dirt here is mostly biological and came away relatively easily. So the right hand picture is what it looked like underneath the dirt, and it's a gentle process of cleaning that really removes nothing other than the dirt. And here these photos show the process of carving the new stone part. So I'm using what we call a pointing machine. So that apparatus that in the top left hand picture is on my bench with the stone legs. So I can take a measurement of the find a point in space on the model, and then find the same point in space within the block, which is the top right hand picture is this block at its starting point on a pallet. And then these bottom pictures show the gradual removal of the material. I'm finding the legs, and every so often I drove the pallet underneath my gantry and let the statue, offered the statue up to it. where the head had fallen, there was also a part of the jaw missing. So I've modelled an indent, which I've set into the jaw. So the orange there is plasticine, where I've modelled the missing part. And then the top right-hand picture shows it reproduced in stone, and a fiberglass pin. And the bottom left picture shows the mouth jaw area pinned on. And then bottom right-hand picture shows some of the missing areas of the jowl and the neck filled in with a mortar repair. Here's the bottom part of the statue on its side on my banker, showing a locator pin for fixing it in place on the wall. Again, a carbon fiber pin. And here it is in my vehicle. So I've left those areas of surplus stone on the side, were left on purpose. The reason for that was twofold, really. One was to give the legs some structural stability, because I was going to be lowering down the upper part in situ, and the four legs are, well, it's all one single stone, so the plinth with all four legs, but they're all freestanding otherwise without that support. And I felt like if the weight of the upper part all came down on one of those legs by itself, it might just ping. So I left lots of supporting material in amongst them to be trimmed away after installation. And the other reason that I left them there was also so that I could lift it into place with straps, and then drop it down onto a bed of mortar, and the straps would just come away cleanly afterwards without having to lift and shovel it around with a lifting bar, which can damage arises around the stonework. And then in situ, trimmed away the surplus material, and there's the statue as it looked when it was finished. Oh, here's some lettering that I did at St Paul's Cathedral. We recut the letters on the clock faces. I did this. So here's what the clock looks like now. The letters had become really worn and they were unreadable. But the architect didn't want to replace the stone or do an indent, so we simply cut the letters as they were, but just cut them back a little bit further. Here they are. So you can see the worn surface of the stonework. And I've just cut these letters back a few millimeters to give them a little bit of profile that could then be gilded nicely in the space, and have and then the black is painted. Here's some carvings that I replaced at the top of the central tower at St Pancras Station. Those two little octagonal turrets with their spire. I replaced a whole bunch of the carved beasties around there. Here are what some of them look like. Oh, and this is up at the Houses of Parliament, where I've been working recently. This is the clock face of Big Ben, of Elizabeth Tower. It's so enormous. I wanted to include this picture just to give an idea of scale of that minute hand. And you can see on the right, those are 2-meter lifts of scaffolding. It's so big that when you're standing up close to it, you can see the minute hand moving, which is pretty awesome. Right underneath there, I replaced some bits of stonework. Here they are, the 3 clean white little miniature pinnacles underneath one of the clock faces. I replaced those. I replaced this other crockety panel. There's a whole load of this all over the building, and I replaced a small part of it. I wasn't alone. There were a whole load of us doing it. Here's a colleague of mine installing it and doing some trimming in. This is another job that I made at the Houses of Parliament. These beasties here, I wonder if there's a, there we go, here's what they look like. These are 2 that I replaced at the Houses of Parliament a couple of years ago. And that's it. I'm going to try and end my share. Boom. Okay. So I rattled through that, but I thought maybe now I've gone through it, if anyone has anything they'd like to talk about, then
Thanks, Alex. That was really, really fascinating. And just amazingly skilled as well. I like how you just casually like, and then I carve this, and then it's an incredible carving, as if everyone can just do that. Yeah, starting off with that point, how did you actually get into stonemasonry and stone carving?
Right. Well, I guess there are a couple of things. One is that I always had a kind of arty streak. So through my school years, I was always doing arty things. I did art A-level, so on. And then in another life, I went to university and I did something entirely unrelated. I studied languages at university, but through those years and sixth form and university, all of the summer holiday pocket money type jobs that how people get. I used to go, in those days it was a window of a temping agency with actual physical cards in it, and I would always ask about the things that were kind of outdoorsy, hands-on type work. So I did things like I worked for a carpenter one summer, another summer I worked for Cambridge City Council, cutting hedges and mowing lawns, and I did lots of building site work, lots of site labouring, and after a while the penny finally dropped that those were the things that had jumped out at me from the window, and whereas other friends of mine had done the data entry and office temping work and so on, and I'd never inquired about any of those jobs. And so finally the penny dropped that I like working with my hands and being outdoors, and so that combined with the kind of arty background, I thought, well, I had a think, and the idea of stonemasonry and stone carving came to me. I had to look into it, and I thought, yeah, I like the look of that. That'll do. So that's how it came about.
Amazing. And then just slowly built the skills up over a long period of time then.
Right, exactly. So I started off at college and then worked my way. I was an employee in a firm for a while, and then I was self-employed for a while in London, and then I moved to France with my wife, and I was an employee all the time that I lived in France, which was 8 years. And then I moved to Oxford in 2014, and I set up my business then again, and yeah, here I am now. Now I run a workshop, and sometimes have other people working for me occasionally.
Come all the way to the top. Have you found that there's quite different approaches between each country or even each sort of county within the UK and between other places?
There's a bit of an echo.
Oh, sorry.
So yeah, certainly between my experience between working in the UK and France, absolutely, and so the main difference is to do with the approach to conservation type problems. So in the UK, I would say relative to other countries, we place a big emphasis on the value of original fabric. So typically, fabric on old buildings will be left for much longer than it might elsewhere, which is completely, logically consistent approach. Whereas in France, the approach is, well, you could say it's more heavy-handed, but another way of looking at it is to think that rather than placing emphasis on the importance of the physical fabric, it's a philosophy that places importance on the original design, and respecting an architect's original intentions is the thing that is given precedence. And so when when an area of a building is decayed and no longer respects that design intention, then it's replaced and restored back to the way the designer of that part wanted, which sounds kind of, for people who are in conservation in the UK, it kind of sounds horrendous, but it's simply placing emphasis on a different aspect of that building's design and history. I mean, of course, within that, there's always going to be decision making involved. There's always going to be case by case decision making, right? So, I mean, no one would consider putting indent repairs into Stonehenge, because what's really important about Stonehenge is the actual physical fabric, right? And whereas something like a smart Victorian townhouse in North Oxford, of which there are lots of wonderful examples, we know a lot about that type of architecture, and most people think it's fair game to just replace stonework, replace brickwork back to the way it was intended to be. And of course, there's always going to be grey area, right? Yeah, I would say is the main difference that I've noticed between those two places. There's otherwise, in terms of approach, people are people, and it's, you meet nice people everywhere. France has an active guild system called the Compagnon, which we don't have in this country, where people who are training in traditional crafts and not traditional crafts, actually, including things like electronics and so on, can do a scheme where they follow a kind of journeyman scheme where once they've completed their initial training, they can do they call it the tour, and they can go and work in different areas in France, and they spend I think it's 5 years on the road doing that if they want to, and then they become this thing that they call the compagnon, which gives them a kind of certain status. And I mean, there are things that do some of those jobs in the UK, but that's the other difference I've noticed, that we don't have anything like that anymore that did exist long ago.
Yeah. Must be such a good education to be able to sort of move across different places when you're learning things as well.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think so. And actually, the companion system is designed to give people a breadth of different experiences. So even if you end up doing something like I do, if you've been through that system, you'll also have spent 6 months making marble kitchen and bathroom tops, and 6 months doing letter cutting for a memorial mason, and 6 months building dry stone walls. And it's quite nice to have those kind of those experiences that you can refer to when you need to and have contacts to. And a lot of it is also about building up contacts, and it's a kind of self-sustaining system.
It definitely really sort of like puts it forward as sort of like an employment rather than and I think what you've been saying from literally from Stonehenge to Victorian houses to modern sculpture, kind of stone has been like used so long, and again, does that affect the approach in kind of how far you go to repair, or is it a case by case, or what materials you use to repair with?
Well, I mean, everything is addressed on a case-by-case basis in what I do, but and of course geology varies enormously, right? So the buildings that I tend to look at in Oxford and around the local area, have a certain stone that has a certain geology, but if you go further afield in the country, then the stone is quite different. I looked at a job in a small church in Wales not so long ago, and they have entirely different geology there. And there's a sandstone effigy of a knight. And I looked at something else a little while ago that was on Dartmoor, where they have these granite standing stones. And so, of course, it depends on the context. So the kind of jobs that I tend to be involved in are, well, certainly the ones in Oxford. The types of stone that we use are largely the same handful of stone types that we use time and time again, because they are what's been used here before. And even if they aren't, then we'll choose things that respect the kind of color palette that you see. I don't know if you know what it's like, but it has that kind of like a champagne sort of honey color thing. And but of course, the other thing that can happen is that quarries can close, because they're businesses and they run out of material, or one reason or another that you can't get the material anymore. So in Oxford, for example, gradually people have looked further and further afield for the stone. So in the kind of earliest buildings, the really oldest buildings in Oxford are built with material that comes right from under the floor from where we are here. And medieval buildings, they were starting to go a little bit further afield, and then gradually further and further up the river, bringing stone by water, and including there was a big kind of building boom during the second half of the 19th century in Oxford, with Bath stone flooding into Oxford after the opening of the Kenneth and Avon Canal. And then, of course, after the railways appear, then you get stone travelling up and down the country. So the St Pancras Station, where I made those beasties, was built with stone from the Midlands, which had come down into the station on the railway, and it was a deliberate statement to show, like, this is the arrival terminus of Midlands railway lines, and this is the stone that we're using. So it's built using Ketton and Ancaster and so on, that come from Lincolnshire and surrounding counties, Leicestershire and so on. And the Houses of Parliament too, again bringing material from Yorkshire, which was probably a mistake given what happened to it. Anyway, yeah. So there we go. So it depends. It depends what it is. It depends.
That's incredible how the different types of stone as well can tell you so much about the history of the building, and whether they're making a sort of a statement, as well as just the kind of aesthetics of it and the sort of the practical elements of it as well.
Right. Yeah.
I realise that I'm taking all the questions. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask at all? You can either unmute yourself, or there's a little hand raise, or there's also a speech bubble. Brian?
Yeah, I've actually put it in the conversation thing on the meeting chat by mistake. Have you, Alex, I mean, you're doing some fabulous work, but have you ever had to replace stonework that's already got historic graffiti on it, for example? And if so, what happens to the graffiti?
I'm just trying to think if I've ever had to do that. I've got to say that I don't think I ever have had to do that.
Okay.
But if that popped up as a question, let's say there was something that needed to be replaced because it was structurally unsound, or if there was some other really valid reason for replacing something, like if it was dangerous. I mean, that's the time when there's no question. You know, if something actually poses a danger to human beings, then it's you can have a really strong case, make a strong case for replacing something. But if it had some important historical evidence on it, then I guess I would probably look to do something like perhaps cut that part out of the original stonework and set it into the replacement. Would be one way of treating that. I would probably rather do that than reproduce it myself, I think, because it's if it was still readable, and again, readability is a big, you know, question, right? Because especially if you're talking about lettering, I mean, once lettering becomes eroded to the extent that it's not decipherable, you know, at what point does what it originally looked like become more important than the fabric itself? And I think probably for lettering, that the point that the line in the sand there is when it's no longer readable, unless there's some other good reason, like it was engraved by somebody famous. You know, if it was Winston Churchill's name scratched into a school desk or whatever, then you know you've got some sort of really valid reason to keep the original fabric, even if it's lost readability. Otherwise, yeah, there we go. But that's how I would approach that. If it was still readable and worth keeping, which it probably would be, then I would say cut that piece out of the original stone and set it into replacement.
Just an extra piece of difficulty for you.
That's right. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Brilliant, thanks, Brian. Does anyone else have any questions at all?
Okay, I think there are a number of questions in the chat box.
Oh. Brilliant, thanks. Sorry, I couldn't see that first. Nor will they pop up. Brooke, did you want to ask your question? Or do you want me to read it out for you?
Oh goodness, I've just pulled that up myself.
Thanks. I'm happy to ask it.
Notification. They've come up without notification.
The question was just, Alex, in your presentation at the beginning, where you showed images of yourself and your team doing some carving, it looked like you were using air compression tools. And have I interpreted that correctly? And if so, is that a normal thing to do?
Yeah, totally normal, and I use them all the time. So I use power tools, and again, this is a question that sometimes pops up because there are questions about authenticity, you know, of respecting methodology, that whether the methodology you're using is somehow sort of consistent with the way a stone might have been worked the first time round. I'm open about the fact that I use power tools. I think it's a logically coherent, consistent way of working, especially when you can reproduce. The critical thing is, if you're replacing a piece of historic stonework, can you replace it in a way that is consistent with what's around it? So obviously, if you're looking at a wall which has got dressed stonework where it's been left with a tooled surface, then if I cut a piece of stone down to size with an angle grinder and leave it with a honed surface, then it will look out of place. But the physical shaping, there's nothing, I think, say you couldn't shape that stone with your angle grinder and then put onto that surface a tooled surface with hand tools, for example, and that would give a finish which would be completely indistinguishable, even by a seasoned professional, from a stone that had been dressed from the start with hand tools. But yeah, I use air tools all the time. So principally, I use angle grinders for shaping of the kind of umbrella shapes, so kind of roughing out. And then I use compressed air chisels. So it's the same chisels that you could use with a dummy, with a hammer, which I use as well. I have hand tools and I use them all the time, particularly on site when compressed air isn't available. And then they're fed by so the air tools are the same chisels at the front end, but at the back end they have a special shank that fits into my air gun, which in the back of the gun has a tiny little hammer which hits the back of the chisel the same way hammer would if you held it in your hand. So it's no different really. It just strikes the chisel much more frequently than you could if you used your hand. So in terms of what the chisel is doing to the stone, it's the same. It gives the same finish, the same texture. It's just a lot faster. So I use air tools all the time for that reason. And also for really fiddly work, I often use a die grinder as well, which is like a kind of air-powered dentist drill type thing with different shaped heads, which it's really nice for getting into fiddly little holes. But I don't just use the power tools. I also use hand tools, and I use rasps and small rasps called rifflers, which are really nice for cleaning up surfaces in fiddly places. But yeah, I use air all the time because it does the same job, but it's much faster.
Yeah, it makes total sense. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Cheers, thanks. I think Joe Cox, you had a question about original carvings.
Oh, yes, I wanted to know if you ever get the opportunity to do a completely original carving of something that has moulded to nothingness, and if you can get in any sort of cheeky satire, you know, sort of a picture of a despicable dean or something.
Right, so very occasionally I get a bit of license along these lines, mostly not, mostly because of a range of reasons really, but typically if I'm a lot of carved detail, if you're replacing a damaged part of a building, you're replacing one thing of which there might be, you know, 20 identical Corinthian capitals. So, you know, there's no question you reproduce the ones that you've got as solid evidence to create the thing that's damaged. If it's individual pieces of carving, like if it's little beasties or so on that aren't identical, then you would, well, firstly, there's consent issues, right? So typically the buildings I'm dealing with are all listed fabric. So you have to put forward a coherent proposal. And you know, sometimes the planning people will you know, have conversations about that, which is not to say that it can't happen, and it can. So for example, if you had let's say a carved creature on the side of the building, and it was so the circumstances would have to be this. It would have to be, let's say it was a carved creature on the side of a building, and it had decayed to an extent that it was unreadable. So you could see, let's say you could see there was a kind of creature there, but you can't tell what it was. And you also don't have any historic evidence for what it was, because if you have got old photographs that show what it was, then you'd be unlikely to get consent for something else, unless you had a really overwhelming you know, reason for doing that. Like if you could demonstrate that it was overwhelmingly in the public good to not recreate a racist caricature, for example, or something like that, then you could have a good reason for. Otherwise, if you've got evidence of what something looked like, then you probably won't get consent to do anything else. But occasionally it happens that there's no evidence for what something looked like. There's a good case for replacing a damaged bit of carving because the building reads better with the carved detail replaced. There's nothing more to be got from the haggis that's left. There's just a kind of sausage of weathered stone, and so you apply for consent to reproduce something new, and you know, sometimes get it. So I was involved in a job this winter just gone at Christchurch Priory in Bournemouth, replacing some large carved grotesques around the top of that building, and me and one other carver as well. And there was nothing left of what had been there. It faces the sea, so it had been completely worn away by the weather coming off the channel. And so we replaced them with new ones. And there was a decision-making process that was out of my hands. So it wasn't me having a license, but it was the decisions of what to put there were not mine, but the design of the new things was. So I made, one was a fox. One was a portrait of somebody who was involved with the church there, with a very elegant big beard, which was fun to do. And one was a royal cipher with a crown sitting on a cushion with E2R. Occasionally, I've had complete license to design new things myself, but mostly they've had to sort of fit in with a scheme that already exists on a building. Very occasionally, I've come up with completely new things. I worked on a job in France where we replaced some buttresses on a church in Paris, and there was some carved detail that was unreadable. And after a drawn-out decision-making process, it was decided by the clients and by the heritage people there to go ahead with a proposal that I put forward to create images showing some of the different people working in different trades on that restoration job. So I carved figures. One was a stone carver, a stone mason, a roofer, somebody doing glazing, and the architect, and that was fun to carve those things. And I had a bit of license there. So yes, occasionally, but generally there's good reasons not to.
Thank you. That was really interesting.
Cheers. I think we have one from Abigail Lloyd talking about the retaining historic patina and the SPAB approach. Abigail, if you have a mic, do you want to expand on that?
No, it's just I'm also based in Oxford, and we see some colleges and churches and other places getting very enthusiastic about stone replacement. And I just wondered, sometimes one's left with an impression that it's done partly because some of them have a lot of money, partly because it's easier just to propose wholesale replacement rather than the slightly more time consuming and thoughtful kind of replacement of only what's needed. And you lose quite a lot of that. I mean, a bit like you said with the Wells stairs, you lose that evidence of historical usage and just age, really. And so I just wondered what your view was on that.
Right. So, I mean, I think, when you're dealing with a building that is very slowly decaying, I mean, you can come up with a coherent plan for what to do, but there's always a good case to be made for an alternative plan, right? There's seldom one really obvious right answer, right? There are often multiple right answers, and they've all got something a bit wrong with them. So, I mean, I think you could make an argument that in Oxford in particular, conservation restoration is done in a way that's more heavy-handed than elsewhere, and possibly a little bit too heavy-handed. I don't think that myself. I think I mean, I understand what you're saying, Abigail, and you're right. Sometimes if a stone is weathered really nicely, it can have that patina that you talk about in your comment there. Often what that patina really means is it's damaged stone. So it's stone that's got so in Oxford, a lot of the limestone that you'll see, it has that that kind of peeling characteristic where the surface dermis of the stone will start to kind of peel back. Water gets trapped behind it. The material that's behind becomes loose and friable. And if you look at older photos of Oxford, if you look at Victorian photos of Oxford and early 20th century photos of Oxford, the thing that really jumps out at me is just how tatty all the buildings are, how black they are with soot, and how ill looked after they are with plants all over them, buildings entirely covered in ivy and so on. I mean, of course, there's always a balance to be struck. I think there's always a balance to be struck, but in general, I think keeping a building clean is fine. And so these the colleges do generally keep their buildings clean. So some of that kind of discoloration that you get with age goes. I don't mind that myself. I quite like looking at stonework looking clean. But you're right. There's always a balance to be struck. I don't think it's too much, but I think I couldn't say that you're wrong if you do.
Thanks very much.
Thanks. And I think we're coming up to time, so I think it's really nice to just finish with a comment that Debbie Dance left, very rightly singing your praises, saying that you are a true artist and a craftsman, and very, very lucky to have you in Oxford, and also mentioning that the Magdalen Wrestlers won an Oxford Preservation Trust Award. Debbie, feel free to put your microphone on as well, if you'd like. If you have one. Yes.
Hi. Alex knows I'm a fan.
Oh, thank you.
And his workshop is amazing, and it's wonderful that you do the work that you do. But fantastic to hear you talk about it, and to talk about, you know, the thought process and the very, you know, thoughtful way in which you make the decisions. So, and our conservation officers are there to make sure that we don't overdo the work in Oxford, I think, too. Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you, Lincoln, as well.
Thanks. Right, I think we possibly have one more question that's been typed, and then we may have to wrap up to give everyone a chance to leave, but we'll just wait for this type of one to go. Alex, is there anything else you oh, here it is. Oh, sorry, I've just got one saying thank you, and I think another one is being typed. Yes. Oh, no, the typing's gone. Right, okay, in that case then, I think that was Mark trying to talk. Mark, if you wanted to ask on a on your microphone instead, then please do that. If not, then we'll wrap up.
No, I'm fine. Let's finish there. Thank you.
Lovely, right. Okay, thanks very much again, Alex, and thank you to the Heritage Lottery Fund who have funded this very generously for us through the Wisbech Town Heritage Project. This is obviously the second of a load of heritage skill talks and events we've got going on. So if you check out their website, you can see more. And you could, I think we'll have a recording of this again. And Alex also has a website as well. So if you want to get in contact with him with any more questions or commissions or anything like that, then please do. Thanks again, Alex, for your time, and thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thanks.